10:03 a.m., June 19, 1944, aboard USS Lexington. Radar screams, "Not planes, a wall." Lieutenant Alex Vraciu shoves the throttle in a Hellcat leaking oil and shaking itself apart. His guns carry a suicide load. In 8 minutes, he will set the sky on fire. The air over the Pacific no longer smelled like salt. It smelled like high-octane fuel and panic. On the flight deck, crews sprinted, pointed, shouted men who had done this 100 times, suddenly moving like the clock was about to run out. Below decks, radar operators stared at their scopes in disbelief. This wasn't a squadron. It wasn't even a wing. It was a solid mass of static rolling across the screen at hundreds of miles an hour. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet had emptied its carriers. Every flyable aircraft was airborne, climbing hard, coming straight for the American ships. Intelligence said 400, maybe more, the largest single aerial strike ever launched at sea. And standing between that oncoming storm and the fleet was one pilot, one fighter, and one engine that sounded like it hated being alive. Alex Vraciu sat strapped into his Hellcat as it vibrated beneath him, oil streaking across his canopy, the supercharger rattling like loose teeth. By the book, this plane should never fly. By reality, it had to. Because in minutes, not hours, not later, the sky was going to fall. And someone had to be there when it did. They called him the janitor, not to his face, never to his face, but everyone on Lexington knew the nickname. Alex Vraciu was the officer who wouldn't stay in his lane. Officers flew planes. Enlisted men fixed them. That was the rule. Vraciu broke it daily. While other pilots killed time with cards, cigarettes, and half-written letters home, Vraciu was somewhere else, entirely down in the steel belly of the ship, elbow-deep in grease, arguing with men who had been loading aircraft guns since before he could shave. The fight started the night before. In the armory, under flickering lights and dripping pipes, Vraciu stood over stacks of ammunition belts like a gambler studying cards. The Navy issued a standard recipe: armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer-safe, balanced, approved. Vraciu looked at it like cold leftovers. He didn't want tracers. They lied. They weighed differently. They curved wrong at range. Worse, they screamed your position to the enemy. Firing tracers was like pointing at yourself in the sky and begging to be shot. What he wanted instead made the armorer stare at him like he'd lost his mind. M8 armor-piercing incendiaries, silver-tipped. All of them. No steel, no tracers, just fire. A hot belt. The kind that could cook off in the wing if the guns jammed. The kind that turned a fighter into a flying bomb. The chief warned him. Explain the heat, the risks, the regulations. Vraciu didn't argue with manuals. He argued with reality. He had seen Japanese Zeros up close, beautiful, fast, and hollow. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. An American Hellcat could take punishment and limp home. A Zero couldn't. Punch a hole and it flew. Light it and it died. The squadron laughed when they heard. Called it the suicide mix. Said he'd jam on the first pass and die alone. Vraciu ignored them. He stayed until the armorer gave in, exhausted. By sunrise, 6 guns were loaded exactly his way. 2,400 rounds. Almost all silver. Invisible fire. And now, as the deck shook and the sky filled with incoming death, Alex Vraciu sat in a broken Hellcat, carrying an idea everyone else thought would get him killed. The engine was already angry before he released the brakes. Not rough angry. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial shook the Hellcat so hard his teeth clicked together, oil spitting across the canopy in greasy arcs that smeared the world into color. The supercharger rattled in its housing like it wanted out. Any checklist in the Navy would have grounded this aircraft on the spot. Any normal morning VCU would have taxied back, climbed out, and let a mechanic shake his head. This wasn't a normal morning. The deck officer's arm dropped. Steam slammed into the catapult. The Hellcat was kicked forward like it had been rear-ended by a freight train. VCU was crushed into the seat as the aircraft screamed down the short deck, heavy with fuel, and a belt of fire coiled inside its wings. For a heartbeat, the nose dipped toward the Pacific. One bad vibration, one missed cylinder, and he would skip once, then disappear. The prop bit. The Hellcat clawed upward, slow and stubborn climbing, like it was hauling its own coffin behind it. VCU shoved the nose higher anyway. Altitude was life. You could trade it for speed, but you could never buy it back. At 15,000 feet, he punched through the clouds. The oil smear worsened. He leaned forward, squinting through a clean sliver of glass on the side panel, flying by instinct and feel. The radio crackled tight, urgent. Vector 270. Angels 20. Many bogeys. Repeat, many bogeys. The scramble had scattered the squadron. VCU was alone or close enough to it. One damaged fighter. One unapproved ammo load. And ahead of him, the largest air raid the Pacific had ever seen was rising out of the haze. He charged the guns. He felt the belt shift heavy and quiet, waiting. Then he pushed the throttle past the stop into emergency power. The engine screamed in protest. VCU patted the panel, voice low. "Don't die on me yet," he said. "We've got work to do." The sky ahead didn't look like a formation. It looked like a migration. Black dots thickened into shapes, then into layers, tier upon tier of aircraft, stacked from the waves to the high sun. At the bottom, torpedo bombers skimmed the ocean like sharks. In the middle, Judy dive bombers droned forward in loose, sloppy lines that told VCU everything he needed to know. Green pilots, rookies, and circling above them all like angry wasps guarding the hive were the Zeros, the planes that had owned the Pacific for 2 long years. The numbers were absurd. 50 aircraft in this single cluster alone. One Hellcat with a sick engine and a belt everyone said would kill him first. VCU wiped oil from the inside of the canopy with a rag, the vibration rattling the stick in his hand. A sane pilot would have turned back. A smart pilot would have waited for help. VCU wasn't interested in being sane or smart. He was interested in being effective. He didn't see enemies. He saw geometry, straight lines, predictable speeds, pilots trusting numbers instead of awareness. They were flying like nothing could touch them, like no one would dare come alone. VCU pulled back on the stick and climbed. He needed the sun. In air combat, the sun was camouflage armor and silence all at once. He clawed his way higher, the supercharger screaming until the Hellcat sat at 24,000 feet perched above the formation. From up here, it was clear this wasn't discipline. It was overconfidence. He picked his first target, a Judy drifting slightly wide, struggling to hold position. Probably young, probably terrified. VCU didn't think about that. He tipped the nose down. The Hellcat fell like a safe dropped from a roof. Airspeed wound past 300, then 400 knots. The shaking smoothed into a scream of wind. This was the moment the experts had warned him about, the moment the hot belt would either work or kill him. 600 yards. The Judy filled the sight. VCU didn't spray. He waited until he could see rivets. Then he tapped the trigger. The burst lasted less than a second. No tracers, no glowing warning, just invisible force. The silver-tipped rounds slammed into the Judy's wing root exactly where VCU knew the fuel lived. There was no trail of smoke, no slow leak, no wounded airplane limping away. The impact ignited instantly. The bomber didn't fall, it came apart. One heartbeat, it was metal. And then the next, it was a rolling orange fireball tumbling end over end toward the sea. The flash was so bright, it reflected off VCU's own instruments. He didn't stay to watch. Speed was life. VCU pulled up hard, trading the violent rush of the dive for altitude, shooting back into the sun before the gunners below could even understand what had happened. When he looked back, the formation was rippling. Pilots were craning their heads, searching for a squadron, a pack, anything that made sense. They didn't realize it was one aircraft, one man. He rolled and dove again. Target 2 sat deeper in the pack, tighter, riskier. If he missed, he'd overshoot straight into zero guns. The Hellcat screamed downward at 400 miles an hour. This time, the rear gunner saw him. Thin streams of 7.7mm rounds zipped past the canopy like angry fireflies. VCU didn't flinch. He waited until the nose filled his glass and tapped the trigger again. The incendiaries walked across the fuselage. They hit the engine. Magnesium flared white hot. The front of the bomber vanished in flame. The prop tore loose, spinning away like a toy. The Judy pitched up, rolled and fell, trailing thick black smoke, VCU's signature written across the sky. 2 kills. Less than 2 minutes. The experts had been wrong. The armorer had been wrong. The suicide belt wasn't unstable, it was decisive. VCU checked his counters, barely touched. Then the hive woke up. Above him, the zeros rolled over together, diving out of the sun, hunting the ghost that was burning their bombers alive. These weren't clumsy targets. These were killers. Fast, agile, and angry. VCU watched them break formation and felt something shift. They weren't veterans. They turned wide. They chased individually. They made mistakes. 1 0 separated, trying to cut off his climb. The pilot pulled too hard, hanging on the prop for a split second. Physics froze him there. VCU dropped the nose and fired. The rounds hit the wing root. No armor, no ceiling tanks. The fighter disintegrated in a flash of fire and debris, pieces of burning aluminum fluttering toward the ocean. 3 kills, 3 minutes. And the sky was no longer ignoring him. The shadow swept over his canopy like a closing door. VCU looked up and saw them zeros a dozen, at least noses down, wings flashing as they dove together. The easy kills were over. The brawl had arrived. His engine was shaking harder now, the panel blurring every vibration, a reminder that this fight could end with one bad cough. He was low on energy, out of position, and alone in the middle of the largest air battle the Pacific had ever seen. Most pilots would have panicked. They would have turned to dogfight and died, or run for the deck and abandoned the fleet. VCU chose neither. He chose wait. He knew the Hellcat was heavy, too heavy to dance with a zero in a climb. But in a dive, that weight became pure violence. He slammed the stick forward. The Hellcat didn't descend. It fell. The speed needle ripped past 400 knots, the airframe groaning like it might tear apart. The Zeros followed and immediately began to shake. Their light frames fluttered, controls stiffening as physics turned against them. They couldn't keep up with a falling brick. VCU yanked back on the stick-black spots crawling into his vision as G-forces crushed him into the seat. He knifed underneath the bomber formation, using the Japanese planes themselves as cover. It was a predator's move. The Zeros couldn't fire without risking their own bombers. He had turned their numbers into a shield. Target 4 drifted above him, belly exposed, blind. VCU pulled up, timing his shots between the violent shudders of the engine. 200 yards. A short tap. The M8 rounds hit the fuel tank. The vapor ignited instantly. The center of the bomber blew outward in a brutal white flash. Burning aluminum rained down, forcing VCU to wrench the Hellcat aside to avoid the debris. He didn't look back. The formation was breaking now. Pilots were weaving, panicking, destroying their own protection. They still couldn't see him, but they could feel him. Smoke and fire marked his path like fingerprints. He rolled again, already lining up the next victim. The janitor wasn't finished cleaning. Panic spread through the formation like a disease. The Japanese pilots could see the fireballs, the falling wreckage, the parachutes blooming below, but not the hand that caused it. Discipline collapsed. Spacing widened. Overlapping fire vanished. It made VCU's job easier and more dangerous at the same time. Kill number 5 tried to fight back. The Judy's pilot wasn't green. He banked hard, spoiling the shot, forcing VQ to commit. It was a good move, just not good enough. VCU didn't aim where the bomber was. He aimed where it had to be. He kicked the rudder, skidding the Hellcat sideways, leading the target like a duck hunter on instinct alone. He held the trigger a heartbeat longer this time. The silver-tipped M8 rounds tore into the engine cowling. Magnesium ignited. The explosion happened right in front of him. One instant, the bomber filled his windscreen, then the world turned orange. VCU flew straight into the fireball. Debris hammered the wings like gravel on a tin roof. The Hellcat shuddered, but held together, punching through smoke flame and twisted metal. On the other side, his canopy was blackened with soot oil, streaked fresh across the glass. He checked the wings. Scorched, dented, still there. The engine coughed, spat, but kept turning. 5 down. Behind him, the sky was littered with parachutes drifting toward the Pacific like pale jellyfish. Ahead of him, the Zeros were no longer cautious. They abandoned the bombers entirely and swarmed, furious, coming from every angle. Tracers ripped past his canopy, bright in the sun. VCU ignored them. He had tunnel vision. One more Judy lagged behind the pack, straining to rejoin engine, smoking black. VCU cut the corner and rammed the throttle through the gate, ignoring the temperature needle buried in the red. He closed to point-blank range, 100 yards, 50. He could see the rear gunner fighting a jam, hands frantic. This was math. Him or the fleet. VCU squeezed the trigger. The guns roared for a fraction of a second and then stopped. Not a jam, not empty. The target simply ceased to exist. The tail sheared off. The bomber snapped in half. The pilot was thrown clear as 2 burning sections fell away. 6 kills, 8 minutes, and the sky was finally paying attention. The roar of engines faded and was replaced by thunder. Not from above, but from below. Black bursts of flak blossomed around him like violent flowers. VCU had chased the enemy straight into the defensive umbrella of his own fleet. Battleships and destroyers were firing everything they had, filling the sky with steel. To the gunners below, he was just another speck, another threat. A 5-inch shell detonated off his right wing. The concussion slapped the Hellcat sideways like a toy shrapnel rattling across the fuselage. VCU swore, heart-hammering. After 50 Japanese aircraft, he was about to be killed by a nervous kid from Iowa. He rolled hard, flashing his belly toward the ships, diving for the deck, skimming the waves at 300 miles an hour, getting under the guns, under the radar, under death itself. Only then did the adrenaline drain away. His hands shook on the stick. Sweat soaked his flight suit. The cockpit stank of cordite oil and fear. He keyed the mic. "Lexington, this is VCU, coming home." The reply came back stunned. They had watched the blips vanish from the screen one by one. "Copy VCU. Deck is yours." Status VCU glanced at the gauges. Fuel nearly gone. Ammo still heavy. Smoke stained the horizon behind him. "Status green," he said, voice cracking. "Tell the armorer to get more of those silver bullets ready." The carrier rose from the ocean impossibly small. His gear dropped, one wheel hesitated, then locked. The engine sputtered on fumes as he lined up, cut throttle, and slammed onto the deck. The hook caught. The Hellcat jerked to a stop. Silence. VCU slid the canopy back and breathed sea air. He was alive. The deck crew ran toward him, staring at the battered fighter. VCU stood up exhausted, oil smeared, and held up 6 fingers. They didn't cheer at first. They stared. At the soot-blackened wings, at the dents and scorch marks, at the oil dripping from the cowling like the plane was bleeding out. Then someone counted the holes. Someone else did the math. And the noise finally came: shouts, disbelief, hands slapping metal that was still warm. The armorer pushed through the crowd. The same chief who'd called him crazy, the one who'd warned him about hot belts and flying bombs. He knelt by the gun ports and popped the access panels, expecting warped barrels, cooked rounds, a disaster waiting to happen. What he saw made him freeze. The guns were barely warm. The belts were still heavy. He pulled them out, counting, then counted again. The numbers didn't add up. 6 aircraft bombers and fighters gone, and more than 2/3 of the ammunition still there. It made no sense. Pilots burned 1,000 rounds to bring down a bomber. VCU had done it with 60 per kill. How the chief finally asked grease on his hands, voice low. VCU climbed down from the wing hands, shaking as he lit a cigarette. He took a drag and exhaled slowly. "I didn't need to shred them," he said. "I just needed to light them." A photographer snapped the picture without asking. VCU, oil-streaked, exhausted, standing on the wing with a wild grin and 6 fingers raised. It would run in papers, coast to coast, a symbol of victory. But the real revelation wasn't the photo. It was in the gun bays. The ridicule died that day. The laughter stopped. By sunset, every pilot wanted the same loadout. They wanted the VCU belt. The janitor wasn't a joke anymore. He'd clean the sky quietly, efficiently, while everyone else followed the book. June 19, 1944 would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 400 enemy aircraft destroyed. An Air Force erased in an afternoon. And at the tip of it all was one pilot who ignored the manual, trusted his instincts, and proved that sometimes precision beats volume and fire beats everything. They didn't celebrate him the way movies say they do. There was no standing ovation in the ready room, no speech about innovation, no officer pulling him aside to say, "You changed the war." Instead, Alex Vraciu was quietly told to stop talking. Within days, the questions started. Not from reporters, but from men with clean uniforms and careful voices. They asked him to repeat everything: distances, burst length, ammunition temperature, why he fired when he did, and why he didn't fire sooner. They wrote it all down. Then they closed the folder, and nothing happened. No announcement, no doctrine change, no official acknowledgement that a junior lieutenant had just disproven Navy-issued ammunition theory in live combat. Because admitting VCU was right meant admitting something dangerous, that the system, the manuals, the committees, the experts had been wrong while men were dying. So the Navy did what large institutions always do when a rebel succeeds. They absorbed the idea and erased the rebel. Within weeks, similar ammunition loads began appearing on select squadrons, quietly, unofficially. No name attached, no citation, just results. Pilots were told, "Try this," not why, not where it came from. VCU wasn't punished, but he wasn't promoted for it either. His combat report was filed, his photo circulated, his idea lived on without his signature, and that silence told him everything he needed to know. He had won the fight in the sky, but he had stepped into a different war, one where being right didn't mean being rewarded. It meant being inconvenient. And inconvenient men don't get statues. They get forgotten unless someone tells their story later. Wars don't end with applause. They end with silence. After the smoke cleared and the deck was scrubbed clean, Alex Vraciu went back to being just another pilot until the numbers caught up with him. 19 confirmed kills. 4th ranking ace in the U.S. Navy. Medals heavy enough to pull at his uniform. He could have stayed in the spotlight. Written books, shaken hands. Let Hollywood turn 8 minutes into a lifetime of speeches. He didn't. When the war ended, VCU took off the uniform and put the noise away. He moved to California, got a job in banking, mortgages, interest rates, quiet offices. The customers who sat across from him saw a polite man with thinning hair and steady hands. They had no idea those hands once squeezed a trigger that turned airplanes into falling stars. If anyone asked about the turkey shoot, he shrugged. "Just doing my job," he'd say, and redirect the praise to the mechanics, the ship, the crew. He refused to be a legend. But legends don't ask permission. In flight schools, instructors still teach the VCU curve: close the distance, wait until you can see the enemy's eyes, then fire. They teach that technology helps, but instinct saves. That manuals are written in peace and survival is learned in chaos. They teach that sometimes the smart way gets you killed and the crazy way wins the fight. VCU passed away in 2015 at 96, far removed from the scream of a hellcat or the smell of burning magnesium. But look at the photo, the grin, the grease, the 6 fingers. That isn't a banker. That's a man who looked at the impossible, ignored the rule book, and burned it down. We tell this story not to glorify violence, but to remember ingenuity. History loves admirals and arrows on maps. It forgets lieutenants who changed outcomes with stubborn ideas. If Vraciu had listened, the fleet might not have survived. He didn't. He loaded his guns with fire, flew into the sun, and proved the only difference between a madman and a genius is whether he misses. History has a way of sanding down the sharp edges. It remembers dates, ship names, victories. It forgets the moments when someone stood alone and chose to ignore the rulebook because the rulebook was about to get people killed. That's why stories like this matter. Not for the explosions, but for the decision made the night before under flickering lights by a pilot everyone thought was wrong. Alexander Vraciu wasn't trying to be brave. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was trying to solve a problem in front of him using logic, instinct, and a refusal to accept that's how it's always done. In 8 minutes over the Pacific, that mindset burned 6 enemy aircraft out of the sky and helped break the back of an entire air arm. Not with more bullets, with better ones. Not with luck, with discipline. The photo survives because it feels honest. The grin isn't pride, it's disbelief. The raised fingers aren't a boast, they're a count like a mechanic tallying parts on a bench. 10 feet away, the real proof sat quietly in the wings, untouched ammo-cool barrels, and an idea that worked when everything else said it shouldn't. We don't tell this story to glorify killing. We tell it to honor ingenuity under pressure because war isn't won only by numbers or orders. It's won by people who see what others miss, who question assumptions when time is running out. Somewhere today, a young pilot is being taught to close the distance, to wait, to trust his judgment when the manuals fall short. He'll never meet Alex Vraciu, but he'll live by the lesson Vraciu left behind. And that's how a rebel becomes history, not by shouting, but by proving the impossible and walking quietly back into the crowd when it's done. But stories like this don't survive on their own. They disappear quietly, buried under statistics and footnotes, unless someone pulls them back into the light. Alexander Vraciu never tried to preserve his legend. He didn't correct the record, didn't argue with historians. He let the moment pass, trusting that the work spoke for itself. And for a long time, it almost vanished. Yet the signal never fully died. It lived on in whispered lessons, in margins of training manuals, in instructors lowering their voices and saying, "Here's what actually worked." It lived in the idea that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or command rooms, but from tired men under pressure forced to choose between obedience and survival. Vraciu's story reminds us that progress is often uncomfortable, that the people who move history forward are rarely popular in the moment. They get mocked, ignored, labeled dangerous, until the math proves them right, until the sky clears and everyone wants to know how it was done. That's why we tell this now. Not because it's loud, but because it's precise. Not because it's heroic, but because it's human. A flawed machine, a stubborn pilot, an idea loaded 1 round at a time into 6 guns. History remembers victories. We remember the men who made them possible by refusing to fly the safe way, by betting everything on judgment instead of doctrine, by understanding that sometimes the only way through the storm is straight into the sun. And as long as stories like this are told, Alexander Vraciu doesn't fade into silence. The manuals may change, The machines may evolve, but the lesson endures. When the moment comes, think for yourself, because that's how the impossible gets done. And that's where this story finally lands, not in the fireball, not on the flight deck, but in the quiet after. Because the hardest part of war isn't pulling the trigger. It's living with what happens when the noise stops. Alexander Vraciu carried 8 minutes of sky-burning violence for the rest of his life and never once tried to sell it. No speeches, no memoirs, no correction when the story got simplified. He understood something most people don't. The moment you explain yourself too much, the truth loses its edge. What mattered wasn't the kill count. It wasn't the medals or the photo or the nickname that stopped being a joke. What mattered was the lesson locked inside those gun bays, that precision beats panic, that thinking beats volume, that obedience without understanding is just another way to die. Every war produces rules. Every rule produces men who survive by breaking them. History loves the rules. It struggles with the breakers. So we tell these stories again slowly, carefully, before they vanish into silence. Not to glorify the violence, but to honor the clarity. Somewhere right now, someone is being told, this is the only way it's done. And somewhere else, someone is quietly asking, what if that's wrong? Progress lives in that question. Survival depends on it. Alexander Vraciu never asked to be remembered. But memory isn't about permission. It's about responsibility. If we forget the rebels, we forget how close failure really was. So we keep the signal alive. We tell the story straight. We remember the man who loaded fire into his guns, flew into the sun, and proved that sometimes the difference between madness and genius is whether you're still standing when the smoke clears. And maybe that's the real reason this story endures. Not because of the kills or the photo or the nickname that turned from mockery into myth, but because it exposes a truth that never gets comfortable. War, like life, doesn't reward blind obedience. It rewards the people willing to look closer, think harder, and accept the risk of being wrong when everyone else is playing it safe. Alexander Vraciu didn't change the outcome of the Pacific War by himself. But in one narrow slice of time, he bent probability. He showed that a single decision made quietly, argued, stubbornly loaded by hand, could ripple outward and save ships' crews futures that would never know his name. That's not heroism in the cinematic sense. That's craftsmanship under pressure. The manuals would eventually catch up. Ammunition doctrine would change. Tactics would be rewritten. But none of that mattered in the moment when the sky filled with enemies and there was no committee left to consult. In that moment, all that existed was judgment and the courage to trust it. That's why this isn't just a war story. It's a reminder that innovation rarely announces itself. It shows up looking inconvenient, unsafe, even insane. It gets laughed at right up until it works. So when you hear stories polished smooth by time, remember the rough edges. Remember the arguments in the armory, the shaking engine, the invisible rounds. Remember the man who ignored the laughter, flew into the glare, and let results speak louder than doctrine ever could. Because history doesn't move forward by consensus. It moves forward because someone somewhere decides that survival requires a different answer and has the nerve to act on it. And when the echoes finally fade, what remains isn't the roar of engines or the fire in the sky, It's the choice that was made when there was no time left to choose safely. Alexander Vraciu's legacy doesn't live in museums or plaques. It lives in the uncomfortable space between doctrine and reality, where survival demands more than obedience. He was never supposed to be right. The experts had the manuals. The system had the rules. And yet, in the moment that mattered most, it was the man everyone doubted who saw the problem clearly. He didn't overpower the enemy. He out-thought them. He didn't spray the sky. He waited closed in and struck where it mattered. That's the part history struggles to teach. Not that bravery wins wars, but that clarity does. That discipline sometimes means holding fire, not pulling the trigger. That innovation often looks like insubordination right up until the results come back undeniable. We like our heroes loud and polished. Vraciu was neither. He was stubborn, quiet, precise. A craftsman who believed that doing the job right mattered more than doing it the accepted way. When the war ended, he walked away without demanding applause, leaving behind a lesson sharper than any medal. So the next time history feels inevitable, remember how close it wasn't. Remember the flawed machine, the risky idea, the man willing to bet everything on his judgment. Because the future isn't changed by those who follow the playbook. It's changed by those who recognize when the playbook is about to get everyone killed and have the nerve to write a new line alone, at 30,000 feet, with the sun in their eyes and fire in their guns.